So today, in celebration of Poetry Day Ireland at the School of Celtic Studies in the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, I have the great honour of introducing Dr. Michelle O'Riordan, Assistant Professor here at DIAS. Michelle has published widely on the subjects of the literary, cultural and political landscapes of early modern Ireland and is an expert in bardic poetry. Among her publications is her book The Gaelic Mind and the Collapse of the Gaelic World, which came out in 1990, and Irish Bardic Poetry and Rhetorical Reality, which she published in 2007. Michelle has also published in journals such as the Irish Review and Poetry Ireland Review, as well as in the Irish Text Society subsidiary series. But today I'm going to be talking to Michelle about her most recent monograph, which she published last year in the middle of the pandemic, no less, and it is entitled Poetics and Polemics, reading 17th century Irish political verse. So thanks, Michelle, for being with me today and for agreeing to do this. Let's get started. So Michelle, the 17th century was a very important time in Irish history with the Irish Rebellion in 1641 and the events leading up to it and the events that followed. So your book focuses on a selection of poems produced during that period. Could you tell us a little bit about the book and what this study adds to the discourse of Ireland in the 17th century?
I would be delighted to, Christina. Thank you. And thank you for that lovely introduction. This is the book, product placement. And this is the book without which we wouldn't have my book. So this is Cecil OReillys' 5 17th century political poems. She named it and she identified the poems that she was categorizing into that category. And there are 5 quite long, accentual meter, politically engaged, polemical poems, some of them running to over 400 lines. And the titles of them are The Free on the Winche, Madúr on the Winche airing, An Si Hui Rovadach, Ashte Gavi Condón, Curve the Heron, also known as Ashtayani Huddle, which is actually my preferred title, and Malá Leon Godioga Negad. They're a selection of poems which have a number of characteristics in common. And she suggested in her wonderful and unsuperseded collection, which she edited and definitively marked for our generation and for the generation later than that, that they were poems of the people by the people and took the Irish, in this case, Catholic side. That they were written in the language of the people, the vernacular demotic, and that they represent the voice of the defeated, if you like. That's a very unnuanced way to present her very quite subtle presentations. But her main issue was the editions. So she presented editions which have stood the test of time, and where there are omissions or duplications or additions and subtractions and alternative readings, I've checked them out, and in fact they don't make a material difference to what I have to say about them. What I have to say about them, and that which is making my book the big hefty thing that it is that they needed a little more context. They needed to be examined from within the tradition rather than from what I suggest is sort of explaining them from outside the tradition in a way. She wasn't doing that. She was presenting editions with annotations, annotated lines explaining things that people wouldn't have understood. Historical context, other uses of the words, etc. What I really tried to do, because I've loved this book since I was an undergraduate, I've loved it, is to imagine myself coming to it as an undergraduate and knowing all other stuff about the period, which would have made sense of the poems for me in a way that immaturity, lack of information, lack of scope or whatever affected me when I was reading them when I was an undergraduate. So my discussion of them here, which is titled Readings. They're readings. They don't exclude other readings. They don't supplant other readings. They're another layer of readings. And they're the ones that I found resonant for me. And I suppose my particular objective was to bring the Irish material into the mainstream of English, Scottish, Welsh by default, and European mainstream of that absolutely rabidly polemical century. Such a busy century, I suppose nothing compares to it except maybe the 20th century. The 17th century was exceedingly violent, riven, recalibrations went on in every single European country because of the aftermath of the sundering of Christendom as it had been before that, to some extent. So new denominations, new ways of imagining statehood, new ways of imagining ethnic, cultural, religious identities, some of these right mixed into each other. And I suggest that the 5 poems canonized by O'Reilly in this are nuanced even within the category that she so usefully gave them. So that none of them conforms to the necessarily simplified, cartoonish, defeated Irish Catholic category that they fall into for want of the leisure to present a more nuanced picture, which I suggest I'm doing in this. One, not exhaustively, certainly not exhaustively, when they could, I didn't really emphasize the Scottish dimension, which would be very productive. I kind of stayed more with what was appearing to come from the poems themselves. But there would be parallels which I haven't really explored. So it's only really look at what you could also do with these, rather than no, this is what these are about.
Yeah,
this is what these you might consider some of these aspects.
it's excellent. It's fascinating. I mean, it's quite a hefty tome, Michelle. We couldn't expect much more from you.
Well, one of the things that makes it a very attractive volume is that very usefully, there are 100 pages of translations at the back. So the poems, I've translated them literally, line for line, and magically they fell in line for line. So a line in the English, a line in Irish in O'Reilly's, without which, this is the little companion book really, is to be found in the English translation into English, which doesn't make any attempt really to colour it as far as I thought you do, of course. You're only bringing yourself. You're colouring it with every single thing you do. Quite a lot of it is opaque. We cannot recreate the context. But from the point of view of size of the book, a good chunk of it is translation, all together in the back.
And there is a great benefit to having a literal translation as well, Michelle, don't you think?
I do. And I heard one of our colleagues one time saying you don't really know whether you've understood it, the line or not, until you've translated it into, in our case, English. Have you? Of course you can understand it in Irish because you're bringing all of the hinterland of Irish literature to it.
Yeah.
Can you explain or can you suggest what it might mean devoid of that literary, like the resonance of certain terms? Can you bring them? You can't, of course, but you can try to. And that's where the literal translation comes in. 2 of the poems have already been translated in various ways. Some of them, obviously, Ashta Shani Cuddle, Tirith na Héireann, and Antigua Ravana, which got a lot of treatment because it's such a beautiful little elegy for Audra O'Neill in the middle of it, and because it's a sort of ashling type of poem. They've been translated and published very usefully. Nothing to be said about them of their time, but sometimes the effort to turn it into another poem brings with it the lovely flowing forward trajectory of a ballad, but it might leave out some of the more mundane and punchy, maybe polemical hinterland of the one the one in Irish. That's all I would say about that, really.
Yeah. I understand. I understand exactly what you mean, Michelle.
You do, because you're involved in the very same thing.
Yeah, I love a literal translation. I do. So you chose these poems because of your connection with this book as an undergraduate. Was that? Would you say
I would say also because I thought I could go from the Gaelic mind and the collapse of the Gaelic world up to a discussion of these. No, I couldn't. I
Really?
had to actually go through the middle one, the rhetorical reality, in order to separate the artifice, or to be able to understand the use of the artifice. What was it doing? How was it working to explain whatever, I won't say message, but what articulating what sort of mentality, if you like, that the poet was endeavouring to do according to me and according to our sense of their work. I needed that intermediate step to be able to not abandon, but to contextualize the difference between the disciplines of the syllabic poetry and the equally disciplined engagement of the literary accentual metered poem.
Yeah.
These are not illiterate productions. These are literate and literary productions.
Absolutely. So could you explain for somebody, maybe for the uninitiated who might be watching this, what is the difference between bardic poetry and the poems that feature in your book?
I suppose very simply, it's a matter of register, literary register.
Register.
And literary discipline. Syllabic verse meters have a discipline within the language, which is worked and a very elevated literary register, in which there is a lot of constriction of diction, lexicography, and especially of the way the quatrains are put together. In these accentual meters, you don't have that discipline of having to count out syllables and having to match consonants and vowels. They're a different literary context, but you have the discipline of the accentual meter, which was pound out the vowel sounds, and therefore that has a limiting aspect as well. You can't pick any word you want, but it has a more memorable structure because it's easier to learn off.
Okay.
They both share one characteristic, which is that the quatrains of the syllabic verse are mini poems unto themselves in many cases within the bigger composition, which is always very structured. But at some level, it would be possible to maybe substitute a quatrain or something like that. Similarly, with these here, which are from very late manuscripts, and they've spent many years, many generations, we have no autograph copy of any poem. They've spent many generations going through the copyists and being modified with contemporary references, etc. They're porous. They're porous in a way that the syllabic poems are not. They're more assured because you have to the meters and the diction of that level and that register of poetry has to match. Whereas these are a little bit more porous because a person of some literary skill could put in a line. You or I might even be able to put in a line.
Yeah. So that is really interesting, and it something that I wanted to talk to you about today as well was the fact that these poems weren't composed by poets of bardic poets, but they were extremely learned individuals who composed these poems, and they obviously had a really good understanding and knowledge of bardic poetry and the themes and the tropes and the language of bardic poetry. Would you say, could you comment on that a bit more, on the learning that went into producing these poems?
I think we find it difficult to understand the levels of learning, literacy, and education in a society that's not literate. Not generally, not general literacy. So in the period we're talking about, the minute you're talking about somebody who can read and write, that is an immediate minority.
Okay.
So that immediately means that, now not talking about at the very the most learned level, so to speak, or at the most functional level, in general. And I think, therefore, our sense of how learned they are or how unlearned they are, it's very difficult to, we find it very difficult to situate them. It probably is true that all of our poets here, whoever they are, we're not sure exactly who they are, mostly they're Munster.
Okay.
It's imagined that they're probably clerics, probably priests and orders. They all certainly take a certain political side, which is, at the very least, a requirement that Catholic worship is to be accepted officially. That's one of the main planks of the polemics that they're indulging in the compositions. Apart from that, more than likely literate in Latin, meaning literate, read and write, and very likely in one or more European languages, probably Spanish, French, Italian. Sometimes those who went to, it depends on what colleges they might have attended, very likely in English as well. So
Of course.
they're quite accomplished, and they're very knowledgeable about all the other material that's being produced. Just what you find how aware they are of philosophical debates, political debates, political details, what they're following, clerical and ecclesiastical politics, as well as national and international politics. So they're well-rounded and well-read and well accustomed to taking their materials to the to their public, whoever they may be.
Very interesting, very interesting. Okay, so one of the more general observations I had, Michelle, about your work was the themes that these poems dealt with, that the themes transcended time. Now that might just be my impression. You probably have something else to say, but the Ashta Hiani Chunnel, which is quite difficult to date based on subject matter you mentioned in your book, but linguistically you say it's dateable to the mid-17th century. It's difficult to date based on subject matter you mentioned. So could you talk to us a little bit maybe about the universality of some of the themes and the tropes that you encounter in these 17th century poems?
I suppose there are three areas where they participate in a much bigger discourse. The discourse is already set, if you like, because polemical literature is always rooted in a discourse that people can understand, and then it's manipulated to put forward some partisan view. So we have the Shadicus Quetin, which you asked me to say a little word about, which is the general body of knowledge, which for the sake of the poetry, in this case, I'm saying, for instance, their clear knowledge of Laura Goala, Book of the Takings of Ireland, the saga of how the Irish people, known as the Gael, actually became the dominant ethnic group from whom descended all of the leaders that were current at the time, the Irish leaders. Another hugely influential text is the Bible. And this is something that they share with the whole of Europe, completely. A complete familiarity with particularly the Psalms, canticles from different books, and some of the prophets. So that's another whole shared area. So that's an area that's shared outside of the Irish literary tradition. And the third thing that they're all hugely engaged with is how to settle disputes arising from the denominalization of what was a unitary Christianity in the West. So the Reformation has given rise to several different versions of the Christian worship and catechism, and these are all creating problems in every single country in Europe in the 17th century. And the boundaries where the leader of the country, whether it be a monarch or in the republics where they had sort of oligarchs or military leaders, where these were of a different religion to significant component parts of the countries they ruled over, who was entitled to say what you believed or what you didn't believe or how you worshipped. And these were extremely important political, economic, and cultural arguments of the day, military arguments as well. So there are three huge shared areas in the Irish, in the case of the Irish literary material. Just the more you know of it, the more familiar you are with it, the more nuances you will gather from even a single line of any one of the poems. Novelty is not at a premium. Personal lyric, you may find beautiful lyric lines, and some of them are hugely moving. They are poems, they are poetry. Not personal lyric like we know it or maybe value now, but beautiful engagement with the richness of the tradition. And the more you know of that, the more you will trace them. A different flavour to people who are favour poetry of the schools, the syllabic poetry. Quite a different flavour, but very much based on that shared, it's a different register really, shared hinterland of the sagas, Filiacht, historical material, and the poems.
And you mentioned in your book that somewhere in the middle that you don't believe they got the information directly from Keating, but from another source of early Irish literature or through some other medium. Did I read that correctly?
Okay, it's kind of a there's a sub discussion within the discussion of Ashtiani Cuddle, Kieran Nahiran.
Yeah.
And that is because quite a lot of the earlier material, what I'm saying earlier material, that's a big long historical poem. It starts pre-history. Some of that is similar to what you find in Keating's history. But of course, Keating finishes his history with the coming of the Normans in the 12th century. So that anything afterwards is not Keating based. There's also no need at all to suspect that he dominated, or that the person who wrote Ashtiani Cuddle, Sean O'Cuddle, we say, was in any way enthralled to Keating's version. Because commentators often say in different parts of like a different line, this is not in Keating, this is a different Keating, derives this from a different source, or this is not in Keating, or he departs from Keating here. He probably never started with Keating. There's no reason to suppose that he did start with Keating. Keating was just another text for him. We venerate Keating. Some people venerated Keating. Nothing at all wrong with that, or that's not the controversial part. The suggestion that Keating was a known canonical text within a half a generation of his having produced it. We'll say 1630s, 1650s, possibly very welcome, as was any great syncretic work. When we say Laura Gowalla, we're doing the same thing. Laura Gowalla, no such thing. It's not the edited version that we study as scholars. It's pieces of material that are part of what we recognize as a sort of a unitary linked saga. So a lot of the language that we perforce use simplifies and complicates as well some of the material that we're looking at in retrospect. Does that make sense?
It does absolutely make sense. Yeah, no, that's it's
like
very.
They didn't have Keating in the Irish Text Society lovely volumes. They had what Keating used. Yeah. Keating collected material. He collected it from the same sources that somebody like Sean O'Cuddle might have had in his library, or in the library of wherever he was doing his work, or in the manuscript collection near him. Or it's quite difficult to discern where these materials actually were.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It really is. I feel like I could talk to you for a very long time about this stuff.
A page per day.
Yeah. It's fascinating. There's a lot in it, and I think that's got to do with the fact, like you said, you came back to the material later on when you had an overview of the history, the historiography and everything. So I feel like we could talk for a very long time about it. But I might just leave that there for
Oh, yeah,
today. Is there
thank you.
anything else you think your readers should know about the book before we go?
I think that what you said last is the most important thing, that we could talk about it forever.
Yeah.
We could, because every generation brings a new vision to it. So did they. They were of their time. I think if I just mentioned one little tiny thing, they're of their time, and the Ireland that they're talking about is only defeated pro tem. It was a defeat which had a possibility of victory eventually. It wasn't as if, for instance, contemporary England was at all immeasurably more powerful than Ireland. And that's something that is, I try to emphasize that throughout. That had gone through, England had been through, and Scotland, several civil wars. The Cromwellian behemoth that is in our historical minds is an 11-year like an interregnum. It is the period between the kings. Another person is what he's called by some of the people, the royalists. He's not mentioned. So one of the perspectives put forward in the book is these are equals. These are equal forces. Anything can happen. Anything did happen. Anything did happen until the end of that century. The real defeat doesn't come until the very end of the century. So when we're talking about defeat, in the sense of these are temporary stages of railing against contemporary defeat, that's one of the, so it could be spoken about forever, because every generation finds itself in that dilemma.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about there, Michelle. It does reframe things like that, like you say, that there was no defeat until the end of that century. It's a new way of looking at things. It's not what you learn
It brings
about.
all the life back into the poems. It gives them back their life. It doesn't have them as depicting an end to anything. They're talking about what's going on now, and they're angry and they're engaged and they're drawing in lots of stuff, and some of the material is productive and comes out further down the centuries, and other material, other concepts or events disappear.
They don't have dynamic.
They don't join the narrative. Basic narrative. The most staggering thing of all possibly is that the basic narrative of Ashley Annie Cuddle is actually won. It succeeded.
Yeah.
It became one of the base narratives for the rest of until recently, at any rate, which is some victory for a poem.
Absolutely.
Well, I think person.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to leave things there, Michelle. That's a lovely note, and a nice place to leave our conversation today. So I would just like to thank you one more time for agreeing to talk to me. Your work on these poems is absolutely fascinating. And as I said, I think there's something for everybody in your book, from the historian to the literary scholar to the bardic poetry scholar. There really is something for everyone. Its nuanced approach brings new dimensions to these important poems, and it does add greatly to our understanding of the culture and the thinking in 17th century Ireland. So if somebody would like to purchase the book, would you send them to Cork University Press? Is that where you'd go, Michelle?
Well, I'm told it's at Hodges Figgis. I'm told it's the book upstairs. Yeah, any good bookshop. They don't keep that many of them because it takes up a lot of shelf room. But locally, I'm sure they'll order it for you anyway.
Excellent. And if you're online, I think you can get it on corkuniversitypress.com. And so if you would like to keep up to date with the ongoing research and events at the School of Celtic Studies here at DIAS, you can request to join our mailing list. Alternatively, or additionally, you can follow us on Twitter Our handle is at SCS Library. And that's all we have for today. Thanks again, Michelle.
Thank you, Christina.
Slán agus bhana.
Slán